It's the chattering buzz of ideologically possessed demons. So there's nothing in it that's not entirely predictable. That's one of the things you notice when you're talking to people. If you want to find out whether the person is there or the ideology is there, you listen to see if you're hearing anything that someone else of the same ideological mindset couldn't have told you. You know, like I've had thousands of conversations with people because I've spent 20 years as a clinical psychologist, and one of the things I've learned about people is that they're unbelievably interesting. If you get someone to sit down and you move past the superficial, which you can actually do quite rapidly, they'll tell you all sorts of things that only they know, that are unbelievably enlightening about their own peculiar problems, about the way they look at the world, about their idiosyncratic familial dynamics, like just fascinating personal stuff. It's the stuff of great novels, you know, and this is ordinary people. I don't really think there is an ordinary person exactly. There's the facade of ordinariness, but behind that people are very rarely ordinary. And so the conversations are almost instantaneously fascinating. And one of the guidelines that I used in my clinical practice constantly was, like, I had this sense, I probably learned this mostly from Carl Rogers, was that if the conversation wasn't really interesting, then we weren't doing anything that was therapeutically useful. But all of the interesting elements of it were very, very personal. And so to replace this, and I learned this mostly from Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his detailed analysis of what I would call ideological possession. He talked about people he met in the Gulag camps who were under the sway of rigid communist orthodoxy, and noted very clearly that it was like there was a crank in some sense on the side of their head, and you could just crank the crank and out would come the ideological dogma, and it's all entirely predictable. And people who are in a situation like that don't understand that they're possessed by an idea, right? Carl Jung said people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And it's like, so there's nothing in that that's anything other than exactly what you would predict. And then there's a deeper issue too, and this is one that I think has bedeviled me ever since I made my initial videos, which is it's impossible for those on the radical left to admit that anyone who opposes what they're doing might be reasonable, because what that would mean would be that you could be reasonable and oppose the radical left, and that would imply that what the radical left was doing wasn't reasonable. And so instead of dealing with the fact that I actually happen to be quite reasonable, the attempt is to assume that anyone who objects must be part of the radical right. It's like, well, actually no. There's lots of space between the radical left and the radical right. There's the moderate, reasonable left, for example, and then there's the center, and then there's the moderate, reasonable right, and then there's the far right, and then there's the extreme right. All of that exists in opposition to the radical left, but it's very convenient for the radicals on the left to say, oh well, you don't buy our doctrine, and then to immediately make the presupposition that you must be the most heinous example of that entire array of potential objection. It's like, yeah, well, whatever, you know, it's just not a viable stance. And so, but it's convenient, and it's a bad thing because it drives polarization, and that's a bad thing, but it doesn't address the issue. So one of the things that I've been thinking about deeply over the last couple of weeks and plan to write about, here's a mystery for all of you. I don't care what your political background is, and it isn't like I'm anti-left. I've made videos documenting this. I know why there's a left wing. There's a left wing because inequality is a problem. It's a way worse problem than the radical leftists like to admit, because you can't lay it at the feet of capitalism and the free market. Inequality is a way worse problem than that. But it's definitely a problem. And because inequality is a problem, you need part of the political structure to speak up for the people who end up arrayed at the bottom of hierarchies. It's crucial. Someone has to speak for them. That's the place of the left. But then consider this. So we can state that. The right speaks for hierarchy and the left speaks on behalf of those who are oppressed by inequality. Good. We need that dialogue. The radical left. Okay. We know from 20th century history that things can go too far on the right, no one disputes that, and that things can go too far on the left. And we also know that when things go too far, it's seriously not good, right? So when things went too far on the right, then we had 120 million people die in the Second World War. And when things went too far on the left, we had God only knows how many people murdered as a consequence of internal repression, at least 100 million. And we risked putting the entire planet, we risked putting the planet into flames. Okay, so that's the consequence. All right, so now in the aftermath of World War II, let's say we've come to some sort of sociological agreement, I would say, that you can identify the radical right-wingers. When people make claims of racial superiority, you put them in a box and you say, well, you're outside of acceptable political discourse. And so you saw that with William F. Buckley in the 60s when he started his conservative review. He dissociated himself from the David Duke types, and you saw it more recently with people, for example, like Ben Shapiro, who immediately distanced himself from the Charlottesville types. Okay, so now we kind of have a sense of where you've crossed the damn line in your ethno-nationalism, right? As soon as you move into the racial superiority domain, ethnic superiority domain, it's like, no, you've got to be dangerous. All right, here's a question. Where the hell do you cross the line on the left? Exactly. Well, the answer is who knows? Well, that's not a very good answer. I would say it's incumbent on people in the center and in the moderate left to say, look, things can go too far on the left, and here's how we know that's happened. And that hasn't happened at all. Now, I think there's a reason for that. I think there's a technical reason as well as a motivational reason. Two technical reasons. It's harder for people on the left to draw boundaries because people on the left aren't boundary drawing types. They're boundary dissolving types, temperamentally speaking. So that's a problem. The second problem is it doesn't look to me like there is a smoking pistol on the left that's as obvious as racial superiority doctrines. You know, it's like in Canada there's a lot of push for this triumvirate of radical ideas: diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Which diversity, it's like, well, who's against that? It's like being against poverty. Inclusivity, well, yes, of course we want people included. Equity, that's a more bitter pill to swallow because that's equality of outcome, and for me that's a marker. It's like if you're talking about equality of outcome, you've gone too far. And if you're talking about diversity, inclusivity, and equality of outcome, equity, then you've gone too far. And you might disagree. You might disagree. That's fine. Disagree. If that isn't the marker for going too far, then what's the marker? Because obviously you can go too far, and obviously that's not good. And to close on that, I would also say to the people on the moderate left, if you want your doctrines to have purchase and to continue to speak for those who stack up at the bottom of inevitable hierarchies, then you owe it to yourself to dissociate yourself from the dangerous radicals, because otherwise they invalidate your ideas. And that doesn't seem to be, you'd think the Democrats might have learned that in the last election, but they haven't. They haven't learned that. So, well, so that's my spiel about those comments, I guess.
Okay, so you've changed the lives of many young people and adults in this country, in the Anglosphere, in the West, in the world. You have a massive following. My girlfriend's parents call you Uncle Jordan, for example. On the other hand, and this is just a fact, tons of people on the left, as we've just seen, because of your power and also your frontal attack on a lot of their views, hate you and viciously caricature you. Then there are these other figures, like Jonathan Haidt and Robbie George. They have a lot in common with you. They are respected academics. They are at least relatively well-known outside academia. They share your critiques of the humanities, of student activists, of trends in Western culture. They don't have nearly the following that you do, but they also aren't as hated or viciously caricatured. Moreover, they may have changed the minds of more people on college campuses. That is, people on campuses who have some sympathy for left activists, or who may agree with much of what you say but react negatively to confrontation and harsh criticism. Haidt has appealed to such individuals by taking the Dale Carnegie win friends and influence people approach. So my questions are, first, do you agree with this dichotomy? Second, did you consciously choose one path over the other, and if so, why?
Well, I mean, with Haidt, for example, was more power to him as far as I'm concerned. You know, he has a different temperament than me. He's more introverted. He's less volatile, I would say. He's probably more agreeable, or more polite anyways. And I think that what he's doing is extremely effective, especially from the perspective of very carefully documenting the empirical facts about the ideological, the increasingly left-leaning ideological tilt of campuses, which is something that needs to be explored on empirical grounds. So like I said, more power to him, and there's nothing wrong with being reasonable, I guess. And then you asked, well, is that the right pathway for me? It's like, well, apparently not. What happened when I made my initial videos was that, you know, I'd talked to people a lot. I've worked with people a lot about negotiation. It's one of the things that I specialized in, I would say, in my clinical and consulting practice, was teaching people how to negotiate. And I can tell you some things about negotiating that you might find interesting and useful. The first is, you can't negotiate from a position of weakness. So all of you who are going to be developing your careers in the future, you need to understand that if you want to push your career forward, well, first of all, that you do in fact have to push it forward, because if you're competent and silent, you will be ignored. And you know, that's rough, because you might think, well, people should reward you because you're competent, and yes, of course they should, but if you're competent and silent, then you're not a problem. You're just part of the background that's keeping everything functioning. And so if you want to develop your career in terms of promotion, say, and salary, is like, you have to be competent and you have to be strategic. And to be strategic, when you negotiate for a new position or for a new salary, you have to be able to say, if you don't give me what I want, then something you don't like will happen to you. And what that means, it's not a physical threat, it's that you have an option. You know, so you have your CV, your resume in order, right? You're educated and competent and desirable to people outside of your immediate job. You're willing to instantly put yourself in the job market and undergo the stress of finding a new position and undergoing interviews and all of that. And you have that all planned out, so that when you go talk to the person that you're negotiating with regards to your salary, you're credible. And you see, because it's very seldom that you're talking to the person who's at the top of the pecking order, let's say. What you need to do with them is to tell them a story that they can tell to their boss to make you not a problem. And a good story is, look, we really need this person because they're hyper competent and they have a better offer. It's like, well, then you're going to win the negotiation. But if you go in there with no power, well, you're going to lose, obviously. So the first thing that you need to know if you're going to negotiate is that you have to be able to say no. And what no means is that you're not going to do it. And when I made the videos about Bill C-16, I thought it through. And I thought, there's no damn way I'm following this law. I don't care what happens. And I didn't say that lightly. I thought it through. I thought, okay, well, let's assume the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario would be that a student would report me to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and then they would do an investigation. Then they would find me guilty, because the Ontario Human Rights Commission finds 99% of the people brought to it guilty, because that's what totalitarians do. And then I would refuse to pay the fine or cooperate with whatever the re-education they would put me through would be, and then that would move to civil court, and then I would be fined for contempt, and then it would, you know, then the whole legal catastrophe would unfold. And I thought, well, I could either do that, or I could allow the government to regulate my speech. It's like, nope, that's not happening. So you might think about that as confrontational, and it is confrontational. It's like, there isn't a goddamn thing that can be done to me to make me allow the government to compel my speech. That's not happening. And the reason for that, I believe the reason for that, is because I spent decades studying totalitarianism. It's not good. And the way that totalitarian states develop is that people give up their right to be, their right to exist with their own thoughts. They lie. That's what happens, is that individuals sacrifice their own souls to the dictates of the state, and then everything goes badly sideways. It's like, and you think, well, how much evidence for that do we need? You know, you're looking at 250 million deaths. It's like, isn't that enough? Well, the people that I read who were profound, Viktor Frankl's a good example for beginners. If you want to read about this sort of thing, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And Frankl, and also Solzhenitsyn, and a variety of other commentators as well, who really looked into what happened in both in Nazi Germany and in the communist states. Their conclusion was universal, is that the lies of the state, the lies and tyranny of the state, are aided and abetted by the moral sacrifice of the individual. It's not top down. The Nazis are telling you what to do and you're all innocent and obeying. That's not how it works. Is you falsify your being bit by bit, and you end up where you don't want to be, and that's a bad idea. And if you're interested in that, there's a great book called Ordinary Men. You read that and you won't be the same person afterwards, so I would beware of reading it. But it's a story about these policemen in Germany. So they were middle-aged guys, you know, and they grew up and were socialized before the Nazis came to power. So they were just your typical middle-class policemen. And they were brought into Poland after the Nazis had marched through, and charged with keeping order in the occupied state. And they knew, their commander knew that it was going to be brutal, because they were in wartime, and they regard the Jews, for example, as enemies, and so there was going to be a fair bit of rounding up with all of that, with all of what that implied. And the commander told the policemen that they could go home if they wanted to, that they didn't have to participate in this. And then what Ordinary Men does is document their transformation from ordinary policemen, the sort of people that you know, to guys who were taking naked pregnant women out into the middle of fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And it documents one step at a time how an ordinary person turns into someone like that. You think, well, we don't want that sort of thing to happen anymore. Well, then you don't want to be that sort of person. That's how it's fixed. And if you're not going to be that sort of person, then you don't take the first steps, because the first steps lead you down a pathway that, at least in principle, you don't want to go. So, well, I think part of what makes me combative, say, compared to someone like Haidt, is that I've spent years looking at the worst things there are to look at. And I've learned from that, and I've certainly learned things that I won't do. And one of them is, I won't let the government regulate my speech. It's a mistake. I don't care what compassionate principles hypothetically motivate that move. It was unprecedented in English common law, that move. And it was all buried under this leftist compassion, which is mostly a lie. So I have reasons, I think, other than those that motivate someone like Jonathan Haidt to be particularly passionate about this issue.
So, on the subject of totalitarianism, I wanted to do something very quickly. So, I'm guessing that even though most people in the room have negative views of both men, they have a more intensely negative view of Hitler than of Stalin. I'm guessing almost everyone in the room has a far more negative visceral reaction to the swastika than to the hammer and sickle. Some of the protesters at your event at McMaster University stood behind a banner with a hammer and sickle. You've said that a hammer and sickle is no funnier than a swastika. That, quote, the reprehensible ideologies that are based in fundamental Marxism killed at least 100 million people in the 20th century, unquote. I've discussed this proposition with numerous people in recent months, and almost no one seems to buy it. No one disputes the body count under socialist regimes. Few dispute that Stalin was a vicious murderer, roughly on par with Hitler in moral terms. Most think that communism should not be tried again. In other words, they share your critique of the argument that previous communist experiments did not represent proper communism and that proper communism should be tried. Nevertheless, they still disagree with you that we should react as negatively to the hammer and sickle as we do to the swastika. Why? Because they say the two ideologies are not morally comparable. National Socialism is much worse morally than Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. So what do you say to this?
Well, I would say the first thing is that it's highly probable that you were talking to intellectuals.
Students.
Well, we'll call them budding intellectuals. It is a mystery, you know. It is a mystery, because it is the case that there is something about the Nazi doctrine that seems to have a visceral impact that the communist doctrine doesn't have. And I said when I opened my remarks tonight that it might be the issue of racial superiority. You know, it's something single that you can put your finger on. Whereas what's happening on the left that's horrifying is murky. It might even be multidimensional. Like maybe there isn't a single radical leftist idea that's murderous like the racial superiority doctrine. Maybe it's a combination of 3, or maybe it's some set of 4 out of 10. Who knows? So, and because of that, it doesn't seem as repugnant. And there was also a universalizing tendency among the communists that seemed to be less morally reprehensible than the ethno-nationalism of the Nazis. So, you know, you think, if you go back to 1914, it's complicated, but if you go back to, say, 1918, at the time of the Russian Revolution, it's not like the communists knew that their attempts to bring about the socialist utopia would be doomed to absolute murderous catastrophe, right? They were working in ignorance. Now, it's not that simple, because by that time Dostoevsky had already written The Devils, the Possessed, and he outlined very, very clearly what he thought would happen if people like that got the reins of power. And Nietzsche had done the same thing in his writing. So people knew that there was something toxic, let's say, and deadly about the doctrine. But it hadn't been played out on the world stage. But now, it's like, well, this is why I said what I said at the beginning. Fine. You know, if I don't know exactly how to make the moral distinction, but it's a distinction that has to be made. I think that people who apologize, who say something like, I think that it's virtually, I don't know if it's as reprehensible to say that a given ethnic group should be consigned to the fire and to say that wasn't real communism, but they're damn close. And when I hear someone say that wasn't real communism, I know what they mean. What they mean was, if I was the dictator in Stalin's shoes, I personally would have brought in the utopia. That's what that statement means. And, or it means an ignorance of history that's so utterly appalling that, that any political statement made on behalf of that person whatsoever should immediately be followed by a paroxysm of extreme embarrassment.
May I say one, because I just want to be clear that these students were conceding that they don't agree. They share your critique of
they don't share it enough.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I just wanted to make that clear. But so they would more or less agree with what you just said, I think, about it's not okay to say those regimes weren't proper communism and that proper communism should be tried. They still dispute, though, that socialism as an ideology is on par with Nazism. So I just wanted to make that
Well,
clear.
we could say communism, let's say. We could say radical leftist ideology. As I said already, there are reasons for the left and the right wing, right? The right wing stands for hierarchy and the left wing stands for those who are displaced by hierarchy, right? An endless problem. But that doesn't mean, that still leaves it in the camp of the people speaking on behalf of egalitarianism to figure out just what the hell went wrong and to take some responsibility for it. You know, it's no joke. And we see these things play out continually. Still, look at what happened to Venezuela. Here's a fun story. Do you know that it is now illegal for physicians to list starvation as the cause of death for a Venezuelan child in a hospital. That's how they're dealing with the fact of starvation, right? You just make it illegal to have that diagnosed as your cause of death. That'll solve the problem. It's like, you know, we have a group of well-meaning socialists in Canada who just produced something called the LEAP Manifesto a couple of years ago, and it's a pretty radical document. They're trying to move our socialist party, the NDP, New Democratic Party, towards the acceptance of this LEAP Manifesto, which doesn't look like it's going to happen. But they were all radical promoters of the Venezuelan government before everything went like badly sideways. You know, I think the average Venezuelan now has lost 17 pounds. And that's not because they were put on a voluntary dieting program, right? It's not good. And so if you're tilting towards the left and you're temperamentally inclined that way, and half the population is, then you have an ethical problem on your hands, which is, how do you segregate yourself from the radical policies that produced the catastrophes of the 20th century? And you can't just say, well, that's not my problem. It's like, well, okay, if it's not your problem now, it certainly might become your problem in the future. So, and I would say it's actually everybody's problem. In the aftermath of the 20th century, it's everybody's problem. So it's complicated. Like, there is a genuine desire. Like, I worked for a socialist party for quite a while when I was a kid, you know, and I saw both sides of it. I saw some very, very admirable people. I was privy, for a variety of chance reasons, to the leadership of the Socialist Party in Canada at the provincial and the national level. I met the people who ran the provinces, some of the provinces, and who ran the party, and a lot of them were really admirable people. Like, they'd spent their whole life, I would say, working on behalf of the working class, you know. So they were genuine labor leaders, and there was also a lot done in Canada on the left that looks like it was actually pretty good. Standard work week, the establishment of pensions, the introduction of our healthcare system, which I would say probably overall works better than the American system, although not at the upper end. And they were working hard on behalf of people who had working class lives. But then I also encountered the sort of low-level activist types, and I didn't have any respect for them at all. I just thought they were peevish and resentful and irritable, and those two things exist in a very uneasy coalition on the West. There's care for the poor and hatred for the successful, and those two things aren't the same at all. And it looks to me like one of the things that really happened when the communist doctrines were brought into play, and it also, by the way, we did the multinational experiment, right? It doesn't matter where you put these policies into play, the same bloody outcome occurred. Didn't matter whether it was Russia or China or Cambodia or Vietnam, or to pick a random African country, or Cuba or Venezuela for that matter. It was an unmitigated catastrophe. And so to me, that's experiment plus replication. Enough. Well, that has to be dealt with, and it's not. And the intellectual left in the West has been absolutely appalling in their silence on the communist catastrophe. Like, for my students, a lot of my students really haven't heard about anything that happened in the Soviet Union in any detail until they take my personality class in the second year of university. It's like, well, what the hell? Why are they learning about that in a personality class in the second year of university? That should be first and foremost in their historical knowledge, what happened in the 20th century. I mean, it was almost fatal what happened, and we still haven't completely recovered from it, right? I think, isn't your president, Donald Trump, going to talk to, like, insane totalitarian number one sometime here in the near future? But that's still a Soviet era state. Those people are armed to the teeth. You know, they have the weapon, they have weaponry that could easily take you out. And so we're not, I don't know if you know, do you know what happens if you blast a single hydrogen bomb 100 miles above the United States? Just one. You lose all your electronics. Right, they're all done. Tractors, cars, trains, subways, computers, phones, all of them burn out. And that's it. So we're not done with this yet. And the Korean state, North Korea, as an emblematic representative of the communist catastrophe, and everyone there starves. There's millions of people died 20 years ago. It's not got any better. So it's not like we solved this problem. And there's a deafening silence on the intellectual side of the spectrum with regards to what happened on the egalitarian left. And there's no excuse for it. So
somewhat relatedly, I think it's fair to say that even though you have criticized segments of both the left, social justice warriors, and the right, the alt-right, your critical commentary over the last year and a half has focused significantly more on the left than on the right. A lot of people I've talked to here at Lafayette take issue with that. They say that we're so far from a Marxist takeover of our culture and political institutions that to suggest otherwise is to engage in a classic kind of right-wing exaggeration and hysteria that we've seen before in Western countries in the early to mid-20th century. They also say, and this is important to them, that the nationalist authoritarian right poses more of a threat to freedom of the individual than the left does today, as it has in the West since the early 20th century. They argue that the left may have sway in the academy and large segments of the media, but nationalist right parties, figures, and movements with authoritarian tendencies have risen, become potent, and often been victorious in recent years. And they point to Trump, Brexit, the National Front.
Well, pointing to Trump is rather pointless. I mean, I don't know what Trump is, but to think of him as a figure of the radical right is a little on the absurd side. So, I mean, we are polarizing, and so God only knows where the ultimate danger will come from. If it's the ethno-nationalists on the right, or if it's the radical leftists on the left, who knows, right? I suspect to some degree that's a matter of happenstance. I mean, that's what you'd expect if you looked at 20th century history. But I emerged out of the academy, and the academy, like, there aren't right-wing people in the academy, not to speak of. That's thoroughly documented. And it's certainly not the case in a country like Canada. There's no threat whatsoever in Canada from the radical right. It's like, I don't know, if you rounded up everybody who was on the radical right in Canada, you might be able to scrape up, like, what, 3,000 or 4,000 people if you really worked at it, you know. So I just don't see that, at least in my own country. That's just a non-issue. It's a non-starter. I mean, the last time there was any kind of radical right-wingers in Canada was probably in Quebec in the 1950s, and maybe from the 1930s to the 1950s, but it's never been a political issue.
What about the AFD or the Italian, I can't remember the name of the Italian party, the National Front in France? Where would you? Oh,
well, I mean, in Europe it's more, there's more polarization, I would say, but the Europeans also have problems that we don't have. You know, they've been struggling with the consequences of non-ending violence in the Middle East and the wave of refugees that has emerged as a consequence of that. And so the situation in Europe is different, and I would say there is more movement and activity on the right. So, and you know, I'm not a admirer of identity politics. Well, and that's for the reasons I brought up to begin with. I think that you have to decide conceptually, psychologically, familially, and socially what your vision of a human being is. And if your vision of a human being is essentially tribal, so that you're defined by your collective identity in some manner, then you're going to play identity politics on the left, you're going to play identity politics on the right. It's like, well, I think the identity politics types on the left pose a bigger threat in my country. It's not so obvious in your country because you guys, your political landscape is more balanced, I would say, than ours. If the radical right posed a threat to the academy, which they most decidedly do not, then I would be just as upset about that. And so I think, again, it's part and parcel of the radical left's failure to take, or the left's in general, failure to take responsibility for the radicals. It's like, oh, well, why aren't you criticizing equally on both sides? Well, the threat doesn't exist equally on both sides, not in my country. So I think identity politics is a murderous game no matter who plays it, you know. And on the left, it's, well, we've already talked about that, so what's wrong on the right? well, you stand up and wave your flag and talk about your ethnic identity or your racial identity and you take pride in that. It's like, what the hell did that have to do with you, you goddamn loser? You know, it's like you're one of the great heroes of the past, are you? That's why you're standing up and waving your flag. It's no, you're not. You're identifying with your group because you don't have anything of your own to offer. And so it's pathetic. And I've said that many times, and in my lectures too, and people know this if they've actually watched my university lectures. I spend a tremendous amount of time, and have for 30 years, convincing my students that if they had been in Nazi Germany, there was a very high probability that rather than being Oskar Schindler and rescuing the Jews, they would have been a Nazi persecutor. Because there's like 5 Oskar Schindlers and like many million Nazis. So you can do the math for yourself. And if you think that you would have been one of the few heroes, then you're either someone truly remarkable or you're unbelievably deluded. And so I would suspect that you're in the unbelievably deluded camp, because truly remarkable people are rare. And I've really seen this in the last year or two, because one of the things I have noted, like I knew that people were timid, you know, and I knew why. It's dangerous to stick your head up above the rest. I mean, it's predator avoidance strategy to keep your head down. And I mean that technically, it truly is. To blend in with the crowd is a predator avoidance strategy. That's what fish do in schools of fish. Like, it's very low level behavior. And if you stick your head up, there's some real danger. And the advantage to that is that people are pretty civilized and they go along with the group, and that's a good thing, because, you know, we should be civilized and go along with the group, but it's a really bad thing when the group goes sideways. And I've had many people, colleagues, but many other people too, say, well, really, we agree with what you're doing, but we can't really take the risk of standing up and saying so. It's like, well, now and then, so most people fall into that camp. When I went to Queen's University a month ago and was subject to that chilling demonstration, I would say, where the radicals climbed up into the stained glass window wells and pounded, you know, unendingly for 90 minutes while we were all inside. I had a professor write me the day before and say, look, my wife and I work at the university. We really support what you're doing, but we can't even risk coming to the talk, because what if the students see and complain? It's like, well, yeah, there's courage for you, man. There's courage for you. You know, and so, but that's par for the course, and it's unsurprising to some degree. But, well, but anyways, on the right, it's like, it's an excuse by people on the left not to take the things that I'm saying seriously. That's what it is. It's like, well, he's not attacking the right as much. It's like, well, they're not after me. They're not trying to close down my speech. So I took that personally. So had it been right-wingers coming after me, well, it would have been the same thing. So it's a foolish objection, I think.